Hello and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today no matter what it is you're doing. For our free wire tutorial here on YouTube today, I'd like to share with you something that I've been asked about several times now, and I finally caved in and worked out a beginner friendly way to create a Mjölnir pendant. So if you'd like to join me down at the board, we'll look a little bit more closely at what we're going to create together today. So for our tutorial today, we're going to learn a technique to create this filled Mjölnir pendant. It can be significantly more detailed than this. At the end of today's video, I'll lay down the original piece I made about 8 years ago next to this one, and you can see how you can further add to this design if you should so wish. But for today, we're going to learn an entry-level variation of the Mjölnir pendant, which is this design today. So I just pop that up in the corner. In terms of wire, I'm going to be working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire. This is round in raw copper. If you wanted to create the frame in a slightly heavier wire, such as a 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire, you absolutely can. What I'm going to do is work in the 18 gauge 1mm and then give it a light hammering. I'm working with a length of approximately 16 inches or so, and again this is 1mm 18 gauge round raw copper. The first thing that I'm going to do, as ever, is give that a lovely warm through, especially for now that central section. Making the wire warm and fluid is key to success in your wire designs. So we're going to find the centre of our length of wire, and we're going to put a really good sharp angled bend in to begin with. Now, if you wanted to, you could sketch your outline on a piece of paper, creating measurements, or you could even sketch half of it and then fold it and mirror that image so you get very precise distances and angles. I'm going to show you how to make this on the fly without too much forethought, because that's how a lot of my jewellery is made. As I said, we're going to make a very sharp angle. So I'm going to bring the wire back on itself to begin with, making sure that the little shape down at the bottom is very much a V shape and it isn't wonky on one side or the other. I'm not going to close that up. All we're doing at this stage is making sure that the two sides at the base of the hammer are the same distance. So I'm going to fold the wire over until it intersects with the other side. And this is my cheaty way of measuring. So I'm going to make sure that that angle comes across at 90 degrees, fold in the opposite direction, and you'll be able to see pretty much if that's relatively accurate. Now, if you have got one side that's slightly higher or lower than the other, I will show you how to address that now. So let's say, I'll just pinch this open slightly, that the right-hand side is slightly shorter. So because we warmed that wire, I'm going to put the pliers into that joint and just carefully move them up, very, very small amount. You can see that the wire is raising up at an angle, and what's happening is we're moving that bend along just a little bit, and now they seem to be, to my eye at least, around about the same height. You could of course use a ruler and just measure that. The next thing we're going to do is open that out. So what I'm doing here is focusing on this section down at the base on the left hand side, because I want it to come away as a clean straight line. I don't want to make it bend in any way other than at that angle down at the base. So I'm going to draw that out until it's around about that 90 degree angle bend. And then what we're going to do is make sure that everything sits flat down on the board. So you might like to use your pliers just to make sure that that is flat. We will be hammering this together today anyway, so don't worry if it's not 100% perfect. I'm then going to decide how much of an angle I want down at the base of the hammer. A lot of traditional Scandinavian Mjölnirs that have been found throughout archaeological digs have quite a decent angle to them, whereas we would imagine it to be a little bit more shallow. So it's really whatever you think works for your aesthetic designs in particular. I'm going to open this one out just a little bit more, trying to keep these straight lines at the bottom. If they do deviate slightly, you can just get them to flatten out, and then we'll decide how we're going to proceed from there. I'm actually quite happy with that angle down at the bottom. That's what I'm going to work with today. You could open this out further if you wanted to, just making sure that you keep nice straight lines on those base wires. We are going to put a little bit of curvature into these, and all I'm going to do is just rub into that wire to get that to curve around. You could use a mandrel or a form to help you if you wanted to, but I actually quite like the process of touching the wire and just getting that to go where I want it to. Once you've put a tiny bit of curvature in, if I just hold that down for a second, tiny bit of curvature in, you can see whether or not you further wish to change the angle down at the base here. So I'm going to open that out slightly until it sits how I want it to sit. So I'm quite happy with that now. The next thing we're going to do is to take these two outside edges and bring them slightly more upright. So again, if you sketch the design onto a piece of paper, you can follow that design rigorously, and then you know that the angles are going to be exactly the same on both sides. So I've just opened those out. You can see this is a little bit sharper, so I'm just going to open that further, making sure that I'm keeping straight lines either side of the angle I'm working on. Now, because we warmed that wire to begin with, it's relatively easy to work on any minor alterations you might need to make. You could, again, as I said before, sketch the design out if you wanted to. The next thing we're going to do is to bring those two side wires in towards the centre of the design. So you can see at the moment that this wire is much higher. I actually don't want that to be higher, I want it to be around about the same, so I'm just going to tuck it underneath and then it's forced into the position. This will enable me to see if I need to make any changes to the angles down at the base section. So I'm just going to open that out a tiny bit more, and then to my eye that looks reasonably equal. The next thing we're going to do, as I say, is bring those wires to meet in the centre. Now you could use any flat facing or chain nose pliers if you prefer. I'm going to stick with my bent chain nose pliers for the time being. Now you might be able to detect there's a tiny kink in the wire just here. So I'm going to, before I make the next angle, make sure that I'm happy with how that is straight. So I've just taken a second to get that straighter. What I'm going to do now is to come a little bit away from the angle just here. So the first distance is just over 1.1 inches. And the next distance is going to be around about 1/4 inch before I turn the wire over. Now if you're keeping these lines reasonably straight, you could use that to measure on the other side as a guide, but you may prefer to simply use a ruler. It's entirely up to you how accurate you want to be. So I'm just going to use this section to imagine what it will look like when I bring the next angle over. So I think I need to be just slightly north of there. That looks about right. Push that over and we'll have a look and see if that works to the eye. It's reasonably close. I think I pushed it a little bit too far up on that side. So again, to reduce the height of that angle, I'm just putting the pliers into that corner and moving them ever so slightly, just opening and closing them until the angle sits where I want it to. So I'm a little bit happier with that distance now between the first angle and the second angle. So we're now going to bring the two wires quite close together in the centre before turning them upwards. So we've made the lowest section. We're now going to work on these two parts just here. So you don't want it to be too close together because we're going to fit a triquetra into the centre later. So I'm just going to push one side up. You could measure that distance, or you could eyeball it. It's absolutely up to you, depends on how accurate you want to be. So I'm going to put a reasonably soft bend in to begin with, and then just judge whether or not I want to change that. I'm actually reasonably happy with where that landed, so I'm going to make that bend tighter by pushing it further than I need to, and then bringing it back. Now at this stage, if you wanted to, you could open the design out slightly. Very, very soft bend just down at the bottom here. And then I'm going to bring these two wires so that they are slightly tapering inwards. Just a very small amount, like so. Now this part of the design is all about, are you happy with the shape before you hammer it? So you could sketch it out first and copy it religiously with your wire. You could spend a little bit more time than I have just getting that very, very soft curve into position before you start moving up towards the handle segment of the Mjölnir. So I have done a stepped handle on this piece, as I mentioned earlier. At the end of the video, I'll put a side by side with my original wirework pendant from about 8 years ago. And you can see how I've simplified this piece by comparison, but the other one will give you ideas that if you wanted to add further detail to the piece, little bits and bobs that you could wire in as well. So we'll just take a second to get this angle over here on the left a little bit more where I want it to be. Don't want them tapering too much, it's a very gentle taper, just slightly narrowing towards the top here. I'm then going to step out at the side a couple of times before coming back in to create a segment that can be used for the bail. Now for me, I like to do this with a flat pair of pliers. You'll see that I already have a mark on these pliers to denote the point on the tapering section that I want to use to measure a distance. So I'm just going to reuse that one. If you have some pliers that are flat all the way along, such as these, same distance as the box as they are at the tip, they're absolutely perfect. These are just a little bit too broad for my design. Hence, on my tapering pliers, I'm using a measurement. So the first thing to do is to decide whereabouts on the design I want that first angle to take place. To my eye, I want it to be just slightly less from here to here than it is from here to here. It's a very small amount. It's probably 80% of the distance. So from here to here is 100%. I'm looking to take the next angle at around about 80% of that distance. It doesn't matter if you change that up. It's just what I'm using as a guideline. So I'm going to make that first outward bend in one direction and then flip the design over. When I've got long tails of wire, it just makes it a little bit harder. I need to flip it out to the side. So I just want that to be in the same position on the other side. Push that over to one side and you can see what we are aiming for. So I'm just going to show you on one side how to get to the next stage, and then we'll do a little bit of hammering before we move on from there. So let's find the line on my pliers. That is going to be the destination, or the distance rather, between angles for today. You could make it whatever distance you wanted it to be. So there's my first angle. It's coming upwards. I want it to turn right out to the side again. So popping those pliers in at the line on the side of the pliers, pushing outwards again. And it doesn't matter that the angles are all skew at the moment. We don't need to worry about refining that until we've finished making all of the bends. So I'm going to pop those pliers back in at the lined point, a little bit further up, push that up. So you can see we've stepped out, up, out, up, and now we're going to bring that back into the centre. So again, I'm using the same measurement, just happens to be a line on my pliers because I'm particularly, I really like just having one set of tools in my hand. If I need to bring a ruler in or something else, it just slows my process down. So once I've got those angles in position, you can use your favourite set of pliers with flat surfaces. Just to refine those until they are all right angles. If I put these underneath, you might be able to see the process slightly better. And what we're doing is we're not moving the distances between the angles, we're just making the angles nice and sharp. Now the last bend that we need to do will be just inside the central segment. Depends on how wide you want your bail to be. So if I show you this demonstration piece for a moment, we've made all the way around the side of the bottom. We've come up, tapering slightly inwards. We've stepped out, up, out, up, and then back towards the centre. Now the angle I turned up to create the bail section, this is actually the back of the design, that's the front of the design. You really can't see much difference. The next angle that we make is an upright here, and it's just inside this angle section here. So if I pop that back over to one side, bring the piece back in, I'm going to use my favourite straight pliers. Well, these are bent chainers, but they have flat surfaces, and I'm just going to turn the wire up at the top. Now that actually looks like it's too close into the centre, so I'm going to move that over slightly, and I'll show you that technique one more time. 90% of wire work is refining bends that you've made in slightly the wrong place. So I'm just going to put my pliers into that joint, and I'm just going to open and close them until I start to straighten that out a bit. And then I just move that bend along slightly to the right. And if I put that back down, you'll see now that it is indeed inside this section, just slightly. It's approximately in line here. And that means when I repeat this on the other side, I'll be able to bring that second line over to around about here. and there'll still be a nice length of wire up at the top, which I can do a little bit of basket weave and create a very simple bail on. So if I drop this out of the way for a second, I don't want it to go onto the floor, I'll show you how you would hammer this piece once you've got that shape that you desire. So you'd obviously spend a lot more time just making sure that this is exactly how you want it to be. You'd create the steps on the second side and an upright, and what you will need to do, it may be better if you have a slightly larger block, but what you'll need to do is push down to retain the distances between those two bends. If you just hold one side, as you're hammering down, this will flop around and you'll end up with it either being wonky, or it'll be open, more open than you want, or it'll be more closed than you want. So you need to support these two sections, ensuring that these angles that we created earlier are sitting directly side by side, ensuring that you've put all of your bends, if you want bends in there, into position. So I'm not going to do the whole thing, but I just wanted to give you an idea that you'll need to support the piece as you move up through. So I'm again ensuring that all of those angles are where I want them to sit. I'm just opening this out slightly so that I've got space for that weaving to take place up at the top. And you'll obviously need to make sure that that is completely how you want it to be before you hammer. Just a very, very quick demonstration is to hold everything firmly down. You could tape it if you prefer. So I'm just going to take a second to create that second stepped side up at the top of the design, make sure all of those angles are exactly how I want them to sit, everything is symmetrical, and that my upright bends near the top ready for bail making. We don't hammer those at all. We want that section to be nice and soft so that it bends around and accommodates our design ideals later. So I'll just give that a quick scooch across the hammer and block, and I'll join you back down at the board in a second. So here's a piece that I've created in exactly the same way as we worked together earlier, and I've given that a lovely hammer up to around about here just to make sure that all of my angles are nice and solid. If you look on the other side, you'll see a slightly satinized effect. I've hammered this one side only. So on this side you can see those hammer blows. You can put quite a lot of texture into a piece of wire work depending on what angle you use the hammer at. So if you strike directly downwards, like so, you will get a more flattening effect. If you strike on the corner like so, you can get a really lovely bark effect. Many different things that you can do with very simple and inexpensive hammers and a block. So this is the struck side. On the other side we have the slightly satinized feeling as it was pushed into that steel brushed block. So there's the basis of your Mjölnir form. What we're going to do now is create some infill designs, and I've got two pieces that I'm going to show you today. One is a Triquetra type design, which is going to fit in the centre base like so. Might just need to open that out slightly to accommodate it, and I will show you the points at which you will want to wire that in. And then we're also going to make this like squirrely endless knot design that I technically don't know the name of, and that's going to fit up near the top of the design. And again, I will show you the points at which it is best to secure that to your hammer shaped frame. So let's just pop those out of the way and grab a piece of wire. Again, I'm working with 1mm or 18 gauge round copper. This section is only about 5 inches or so, and it came out of my scrap pot. To begin with, I'm going to give that a good warm through between thumb and forefinger before grabbing myself a round form. Now you will need to be aware of the approximate size that you're looking to fill. So if you can find a form that would fit as a circle inside this gap, so what you can do is you can take your round form and slide that in. It will give you an idea of the kind of size that you'd be looking to use. So let's just pop that down for a moment. We're looking for 1.5 turns on the wire. And it doesn't matter if you overlap, because it's very difficult to get those ends to sit exactly flush. So that's actually wrapped around twice, and I'm going to waste the tiniest bit of wire off the ends there because, as you see, they stick up a little bit. So I'm going to trim away with the flash side of my cutters on one side, like so, back in the scrap pot, and then I'm going to make that exactly 1.5 turns. So I'm popping those cutters in carefully to ensure that I'm not cutting the wrong bit. And then what we're going to do is, you can see where the end of the wire is just here. I'm going to go opposite, like so, pop my bent chain nose pliers underneath and push the short tail of wire away. Now I'm taking it much further than I need to, just for a moment. I'm then going to go to the other side. So if we're looking at a circle, I'm going to go a half circle away, and I'm just going to push the other wire round in the opposite direction. So you end up with this weird sigil looking thing, which is what we're going to work with. What I would do at this stage is make sure that those ends are exactly how I want them to be. You might need to refine them dependent on the plier action that you used. It might not be quite perfect, and then I'm just going to give that a tiny pinch just on the ends. What I'm then going to do is open these half circle wires out until I get something that looks a little bit like this. Now the best way to do it is using pliers so that you don't deform those half circle shapes. So just pushing that with one hand. And what I'm looking for is to have the half circle sitting centrally inside the other half circle. So that's one side approximately where I want it to be. I'm going to do the same thing with the other short wire. I do have a video dedicated to a long description on how to make your best triquetra. So if you feel that this is a little bit short, you can always check that out. So I'm reasonably happy with the shape and form. I'm just going to trim away that little bit of excess up at the top, and hopefully we will have a shape that is what we need for this project. If I cut that away, control the end so it doesn't ping off into infinity, and let's just pop that down onto the board. That's actually worked out okay for me. So I'm going to hammer this in a very particular way now. Lost the hammer for a minute there. So with this design, what you can do is open these half circle wires out and just post them back inside to lock the design together. So I'm going to very carefully just open this half circle back out a moment. You can see the half circle I'm working with now is on top of the wire. I'm opening it very gently, and then I'm just going to push that end section underneath the next wire. You'll see now that it's going underneath and we're creating an interlink. So if I push that all the way back to its position, you'll see that we have interlinked our triquetra now. So it's a little bit more stable, a little bit less likely to come undone. It's got actually quite a nice dome shape to it, so it's a really useful technique to learn. Now we're not going to go crazy with hammering this. It's a very gentle touch, and what we're going to do is hold that over the edge so that I have only got single sections of wire on that block. And I'm just going to very gently hammer those and make sure that they sit so that they're adjacent to one another. If you are adept at soldering, you might like to saw through at the top here with a box saw, and just a touch of solder there gives you a really useful charm. I am not going to demonstrate soldering because I don't want to set my house on fire. It is not my skill set. So you can see that it's opened out ever so slightly. So before we set it, let's get that block out the way. We're just going to close that back up on both sides to make sure that it fits together. So I'm actually reasonably happy with how that's working. It's interlinked nicely and it just seems to fit. So I'm going to pop my Mjölnir back on the table for a moment. Now you might be tempted to fit the Mjölnir like so. But what we're looking to do is to have the opening centre point just at the point that the piece tapers. I have one that I sized perfectly earlier, so I'm just going to pop that in instead. That's a little bit of a better size, even if it is slightly lopsided. So what we're looking to do is to have the cut section sitting up at the top, because we'll be wiring onto the two ends which are not cut. So let me just show you. I might just take a second to trim a little extra off this one. Can you hear the difference when you're cutting wire that's been hammered and wire that hasn't been hammered? It's much harder. So work hardening is a thing. It really does affect your work. So that's a little bit more even. And what we're going to do is talk about where to attach the wire Triquetra into the frame. So if you attach wires near to an open cut section, it's very, very risky because they might just come undone. So I'm going to show you where to attach these now and what wire to use, which is scrap lengths of your 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. So I've had to cut some here because I went through my scraps the other day and used them all. And what I tend to do with designs like this, and I don't know quite why it's always 3s, but it's always 3s. So what I would do is wrap around the inside bottom right of that Mjölnir, I beg your pardon, of the Triquetra frame. And I'm going to wrap that 3 times to the frame. And then I'm going to wrap 3 times around just the frame. So if I take the tail of the wire and push that through the lower right section, that's a second wrap there. Now a third wrap. Push those wires up nice and neat and tidy. And then I'm just going to push that end through inside just the frame. So that's 1 and 2 and a third wrap. Now you could, if you wanted to, continue wrapping with great big long swathes of wire all the way around the outside edges of your Mjölnir. It will look beautiful if you do that. It will be incredibly boring for you to watch me do that, so I'm not going to. What I will do is tighten up these 3 wraps that sit just around the frame before I rotate the design in my hand, complete that third wrap, joining the Triquetra to the Mjölnir frame, and then wrap 3 more times around the frame on the other side of the attachment point. So that's 2. Push the leading edge of wire up inside. A third time, I'm going to flip the design over, and I'm going to bring the cut end as close to sitting on the inside of the frame as I possibly can. Now there's enough wire here to do 2 or 3 more attachments, but the main thing you need to look at here is getting that end. Hopefully it will finish off just inside the frame here, and we need to get those wraps super, super tight. Now before I give that a final squish of approval, I will add a wrap here on the equal and opposite side, and then I will wrap again at the corner points here and here. Now there will be a little bit of stress at this stage that means your Mjölnir and Triquetra could open up. Don't worry about it, just sit it as if you've soldered that section, get it sat in, get it to sit perfectly symmetrically. At this stage it's still a little bit fluid. Once you're happy with exactly where it sits, you can get everything looking nice and smooth and flat. I think I've mangled one of those sections of wire there, so if I was making this to sell, I would undo that 3, 3 and 3 wrap and make it again, but perfect. I'm demonstrating to you today. There we go. So give that a nice squish and a squeeze so it becomes slightly flatter. If I tilt that on its side, the light will catch and it will show you it's a little bit flatter. Pop it down to the board and I'll point out where you need to attach next. So you would repeat the same process on the left hand side, 3 around the frame, 3 around both the Triquetra and the frame, finishing with 3 around just the frame. Exactly the same technique at this corner and this corner. And then we're going to make the second infill shape now. This is the second infill shape. It's a type of knot. I'm sure it has a name. I simply don't know it. I like to think of it as a clover. So I'm going to show you how to make a clover knot now. You can make it with the very base of your round nose pliers, or you can employ your multi-step bail making pliers. They're an absolute godsend to have. Really, really useful tool. If you can get your hand either on the 2-step or the 6-step, they are really, really handy. Let's pop down to the board and make one of these. Again, I'm working with 1mm or 18 gauge round wire. This is raw copper. It's only about 4.5 inches and it's from my scrap pot. If I pop the little, let's call it a knot up at the top. Maybe we should call it a clover knot. Let's put the clover knot up at the top, and we're going to work now on recreating this piece to sit higher up in the Mjölnir design. As an independent design, both this and the Triquetra are really lovely to work with. So right down at the very, very fattest part of those round nose pliers, I'm going to clasp the end of my wire. And I'm going to start creating a lovely round form. Now you can remove your pliers and move them exactly as you want to until they just start to cross over. You see, they're just crossing over there. And what I like to do is take this as an opportunity just to trim away any scraggly ends. And you can get a really lovely flush moment then, so that the wire just goes across the end of that beginning point. The end of the beginning? That makes no sense. What I'm going to do is give that a quick squish to make it flat and to give it some wire hardening already so that it doesn't lose its shape as we work through the next section. So what we're going to do is to create another loop shape, and I'm going to do this around like so. So again, it's at the very, very base of those round nose pliers, and I'm going to rotate the wire up towards until it almost meets. Can you see there's a gap? And I'm going to draw that tail of wire around and across. It can go over or under at this stage, and what we're looking to do is almost like a capital B shape, like so. And again, at this stage, what I'm going to do is give everything a bit of a squish. Now, I'm not going over any wires that are one on top of the other, like so. I'm not squashing down like that. I am pressing where two wires are side by side. So here you can see I'm pressing down on wires that are doing two loops side by side, but not any time they cross over. Giving that a really lovely squish, and that keeps a nice firm shape. So we're going to repeat the exact same thing now for a third loop. A little bit of heat into the edge that's coming away. Pop those pliers in and start rotating them around until you're really, really close. Now at this stage, I like to bring the tail of wire underneath because the first line goes over the top. It just adds a little bit of dynamism to the shape. You can take the wires wherever you want to. We're just looking to create 4 circles together. So I'm going to bring that tail underneath this time, and we'll have a look at how that is sitting. So again, if you discard the first of those loops, you've made another capital B, and what we're going to do is give those a bit of a squish, but you need to be aware there's a height difference now, so I would just squish that third loopy shape by itself, maybe give it a very gentle touch like so, but what we don't want to do is put any stress or pressure on it. So we're going to repeat for the third time, rolling those pliers around. So bring those pliers in. You could put a mark, but I'm just using what I think looks like the widest part. Rotate the wire to the pliers if it's easier for you. You can see we've got that gap in there. Bring the tail over the back and then just rotate that until they sit adjacent. So your 2 loops are side by side. Flip the design over, and then we're just going to finish off that last little bit. And what you could do is just draw that wire a little bit further around, so that you can cut off exactly where this tail crosses over that last pass. Now you do need to make sure that you are cutting the correct wire. Give that a snicked, a little bit of a Wolverine snicked there, and then flatten that loop down so that the end bit is flush to its own circular form. Now you will be able to put a little bit of hardening just here, because those two are on the same level. This one's all on its own little level. And give that a bit of a squish, and you've hardened that without needing to hammer it. If you decide that you want to hammer it like my stunt piece just here, it's a case of doing a quarter at a time. So I'm resting this on the very corner of my block. Oh, there's my camera, hello. So that what we're going to do, if we were to strike that with the hammer, which I've lost again, we would never be striking anywhere that the wires cross over. It is nice to give it a little bit of work hardening because it just means that it's stronger in its final situation. So let's take that stunt piece out of the way, and I'll show you where this will sit in the final design. So imagine, if you will, that we've wired in here, here, here and here. That means that your Triquetra is securely set. And what we're going to do is fill just up towards the handle. Now I'll show you one piece and then talk you through where else it is going to sit. So I'm going to grab again the residue of that 0.4mm. This is equivalent to 26 gauge. And what we're going to do is find where it will best sit. So you could either wire this lowest loop to the sides, or you could wire the right hand loop to this straight section here. As long as you've got one on this side, one on this side, and then on both sides up at the top, so from this section across here, three around both, three around the frame, 3 around both, and then 3. That will be nice and secure, and then you can take it all the way up to the top. I'm just going to put the other wire away now because you've seen how to add on. You're just doing the exact same thing, sighting this, what did we call it? Was it a clover knot? A clover knot, let's call it a clover knot. You just find a good 4 points to connect your clover knot to the frame. I would suggest here, here, here and here. And once that's connected, you can focus on your, it could be a very simple bail or it could be a complicated bail. I'll show you the example I made earlier today, which is this one. What I've done is I have woven with a figure of 8, 3 and 3 basket weave, and I did that for about 1.25 inches before drawing the tails of the wire through the gap. So weave 1.25 inches, rotate that around and draw the wires back through the tiny hole up at the top here, which is just here, and then wrapping twice with that heavy 1mm 18 gauge wire around itself, and it gives you a really sturdy, really simple and clean lines. A lot of my designs have got coils and floral motifs and things, but this one I wanted to be a little bit cleaner. I hope you've enjoyed the Mjölnir pendant in wire today with me. I'm Gem Hawks. This is my YouTube channel. If you like the content, please do drop me a like and a subscribe to keep up to date with what I'm doing. Generally speaking, there'll be one wirework tutorial every week. It's usually released on a Sunday at 4 PM British time or 11 AM Eastern Standard. Or summertime, whatever time it is, I really don't know anymore. There's so many time zones I have to think about. Have yourself a beautiful day. I'll pop this one down on the board in a second. This is one I made about 8 years ago. It'll show you a little bit more detail, and you can see what sort of options you might like to do if you go for a larger design for your Mjölnir, what you might like to add in as well. Have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.